Welcome to the Supported Living Property Podcast with your host, me, Lisa Brown, the place to learn about supported living property investing.
Hi Guy, thanks for coming on today. It's great to have you here as a guest. How are you today?
I'm really good, thank you. Looking forward to this.
Great. Yeah, we've got lots to chat about today. I think it's going to be a good one. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about you to start with?
Yeah, I'm Guy Stenson. I work for an organisation called Stonewater. We're a housing association, nationally based housing association, working right across England, 140 local authorities, managing about 33,500 homes, 70,000 customers, from North Yorkshire up in the north down to Devon and Sussex on the south coast. We've got a really mixed portfolio of general needs housing, shared ownership, retirement living, and our specialist supported housing services, which we'll talk a little bit about in this session. But I've been working in housing for about 4 years now. Previously worked in health and social care, and recognised that housing has such a critical role in enabling people to live fulfilled lives, and actually seeing the connections across those different systems. So since I've been in housing, I've loved it, and kind of really recognised that actually we can make kind of really massive difference if we are making sure that the right homes are available to people who need them.
And so what is it that you're doing in Stonewater at the moment? What's your main role?
So my role is I'm responsible for all of our customer experience, so our housing operations team. So that's from how we let our properties, how we to making sure that we do that in a way that is making our property look marketable and reaching out to the people who need them, making sure that we're matching the right people to the right property so that they're living in homes where they're going to be able to thrive and succeed. It's about managing the relationship once we've welcomed those new customers into their homes, so that ongoing relationship that we have with them. So again, they're living in communities that are right for them, and it's making sure that we've got the specialist support that's required as it's needed around income management, income maximisation. Also looking at after our retirement living portfolio. So we've got a mix of rented and leasehold retirement living schemes across country, and looking at how we deliver that service offer. And we're doing some work at the moment to really quite sort of radically change the relationship that we have there with people living in those schemes. So moving away from a traditional approach that perhaps focused on people's vulnerabilities as they often get described, so kind of the reason for coming there, but focusing on what it is that they can bring as individuals, their skills, their experience, what are they going to bring to that vibrant community. It's a lot of work around changing that relationship with customers, and then finally looking at how we deliver our those specialist supported housing services, both working with young people and working with survivors of domestic abuse. And a lot of work at the moment around the way that we work as a specialist support provider, as well as being a housing association. We're a specialist provider of support for survivors. So that's a big focus of the work at the moment.
And that's what we're going to talk about today, isn't it? Principally is around that domestic abuse. It might be helpful to explain what domestic abuse is, because I think people have a preconception of what it is, Guy. So perhaps if you could start by explaining.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose the first thing is to start with some statistics, I guess. So it's recognised that 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men, 1 in 4 people from LGBT communities, and actually 80% of trans people will experience domestic abuse at some point in their life. So that's a really significant number. It means that we all know people who are experiencing domestic abuse in their lives, so that our friends, our family, our colleagues, you can assume that there is somebody there that is currently experiencing domestic abuse. But equally, if we also need to recognise that actually we also know people who are perpetrators. So again, those same friends, families, colleagues, the people that we know, inevitably there'll be perpetrators amongst those people in our lives too. Domestic abuse can affect everybody. It doesn't discriminate on on any characteristics. It can affect anybody from any gender, sexual orientation, any background. But really, it's about a sort of a pattern or of instance of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour in that from an intimate partner or a family member. So it's very much about the sort of the family dynamics, and it also affects, of course, not just the individual themselves, but it also affects perhaps children in a household and that kind of wider family network. It's not limited to physical abuse. It's psychological, emotional abuse. It can be harassment, digital harassment. It's in effect, it's about that controlling and coercive behaviour that is negatively impacting on somebody's life.
Those figures, sorry, are really quite horrifying, aren't they? So you're saying 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men, and 80%, was it, you said?
Yeah, so 80% of trans people will experience it, and often it's about kind of that rejection, kind of family members perhaps kind of rejecting or being kind of abusive towards the individual. One of our services, we work specifically with people from the South Asian community, and in that you often we often see the impact of forced marriages or honor-based violence as well. So it's anything that's going on within that sort of domestic family dynamic that is causing significant harm to an individual. But the statistics are incredibly scary. And of course, at the moment, we're seeing a lot of talk about in community about abuse of women and girls. And actually, it's such a prevalent issue in our society, and it's something that's important that we're all much more aware of, and not just accepting of, but actually standing up against and kind of making a difference.
But I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that's really key for everyone to kind of be aware of is that it does affect everybody, doesn't it, regardless. And I think that 1 in 6 men, I think people's perception of domestic abuse is that it's in heterosexual relationships and it's men physically abusing women. That's kind of people's image of what domestic abuse is, I think, often when it's talked about. And as you're saying, it's so much more complex. And there are an awful lot of men who are affected too. And I think people really, really forget that when they're talking, and they have this image of who a domestic abuse survivor is. And again, the terminology is key, isn't it? Because there's a lot of use historically of the use of the word victim. A domestic abuse victim is what people would talk about. And the terminology has switched around to using the word survivor, hasn't it? More and more.
Very much so. And I think that's absolutely, it's about recognizing the survivor is a much more is a term that is used, and it's very much about the language that we need to be about. It's about how do we support that survivor to change their circumstances, take control actually, and to kind of get their life back on track. And I think the other thing to recognise is that it doesn't go away. That the survivor very much recognises that actually it might be historic, but it's still there, and it stays with its and the support that organisations like ourselves and other specialist organisations put in place is always trauma informed. So it recognises that actually that experience stays with you and has lasting impact. And equally, it's again recognising when there's children in a household, again the kind of the indirect impact on them too, and of course breaking the cycle. If children are brought up in a household where they witness this, kind of what impact is it having on them and their behaviours as they become adults themselves?
There's a lot of research around that, isn't there, about the impact on children and on their future relationship choices and how it affects them. Absolutely. And I think there is really key work that needs to be done on breaking the cycle. Unfortunately, a lot of that preventative work just isn't funded well enough, is it? But that is something that that really does need to be highlighted. I think obviously now we're looking at this from a property perspective, and I think it's really key to kind of understand a lot of the listeners are property investors and are landlords themselves. So kind of understanding what it is, why as a landlord do you need to be aware of domestic abuse? Guy, what would you say to that?
I mean, I suppose the reality is, so if you just think about those statistics, if you've got a property portfolio of any size, sadly, it's not uncommon for people living in those homes to be experiencing domestic abuse. And I think some of the telltale signs to kind of to be aware of, and no one of them in their own indicates domestic abuse, but I think if you see perhaps increased reports of noise or antisocial behaviour, if you may be seeing a sudden increase in repairs or kind of the deterioration in the fabric of the property, if you're having a high level of contact actually as a landlord, maybe it's about kind of understanding what's going on in that home. I think, I mean, certainly as we see, it's important. Our kind of the operatives that may go in and out of people's homes for repairs to maintenance, they are actually the eyes and ears of an organisation. Certainly for us, I mean, they see and kind of read signs, and it's important that people are aware. Opportunity for conversation, perhaps. It's not the responsibility of somebody going into that home to suddenly become to sort of proactively kind of take on a role there, but actually if somebody wants to talk to you, if you kind of become aware, if you become concerned, it's probably important to at least raise those concerns so that information and advice can be accessed. Equally, what you don't want to be doing, it's really important that actually what you're not doing is making a situation worse by sort of raising the subject or kind of sort of flagging on a system somehow that you've got domestic abuse, but about thinking, if you are concerned, what are the opportunities to to raise an alert, perhaps.
And it needs to be done in a very sensitive and safe manner, doesn't it? I think that's the really key thing. Well-meaning people barging in and saying, "I'm very concerned about this," just going to make the situation a lot worse. So I think it's being aware of it and just having it on your radar as a landlord, I think, is really key, isn't it? And just like you're saying, those warning signs potentially that, you know, when there's been perhaps not a history of any damage to your property and suddenly there starts being a lot more damage or something, just when you have those little alarm bells, just having that as something to be aware of and think, you know.
Just thinking about how do you make information generally available to tenants, not specifically targeting sort of sending leaflets or whatever to specific, but actually how do you make sure that your information to tenants is inclusive of what to do if you are experiencing domestic abuse? So just including national helpline phone numbers in there, just a little bit of information. So it's there, it's readily available if your customers are in need of it, and kind of think about how do you make that information safe. So you can have, so if you've got information on your website, for example, it's quite common for that information about domestic abuse to have a little button that means you can instantly close it quickly and it doesn't leave a history, sort of a trace history. Just thinking about how do you keep survivors safe at all times.
Which is
and again, really important that you make sure that your teams, your colleagues, your organisation is aware of what domestic abuse is. They understand it, and they are aware kind of how, if somebody does disclose, how do you manage that? How do you make sure that you get them to support that they really need?
And have you got any advice about how you would offer that kind of support, Guy? Anything that you would be saying there?
The key, I think really the key is that if somebody does disclose that they are experiencing domestic abuse, the important bit is actually to connect them, or to give them information in a safe way that they can connect people who are experts and can provide that advice. You know, right across the country, in every community, there are specialists, organisations, domestic abuse organisations in all communities who you can talk to. But equally, obviously, critically, going through the police, but again, ideally it's to make information available to survivors themselves to make contact in a safe way, but equally to recognise that individuals will respond in different ways, and leaving the household isn't necessarily the right thing or what they want to do. It's important that we don't make judgments, and unless you're in that situation, you really don't know how you would react to yourselves or what's the right thing. The very nature of it, very often there's the element of that controlling behaviour on people's lives means it isn't simple. It's not straightforward to find a way out. Very often, by the time somebody has made contact, they will have been experiencing domestic abuse for some time very often. But it's really important to make sure that you do provide training for colleagues, and certainly in the housing sector, the it's a national scheme, the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, DAHA, is an accredited scheme that I would recommend that any organisation really looks at. It's again, it's backed up by expert professionals who can make sure that they deliver the training and support that's relevant for you as a housing organisation of any type.
Actually, I was talking to someone from DAHA recently, and I think they're probably going to come onto the podcast in a couple of months' time, so we can dig into that in a bit more detail.
That'd be good.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's just, I think landlords need to be aware of it, don't they, and have it on their radar, and just be aware that it's not just as narrow as they're expecting. Like you're saying, it's a huge issue that affects all different aspects of society, and all. It's not just, it's often people of all walks of life, isn't it? It can be very, very wealthy people right down to people, so the whole spectrum is affected, really.
Yeah.
From a property perspective, when you're looking at finding the right schemes, obviously when we're looking at supported living schemes for people, quite a few property investors I speak to are really keen on working with domestic abuse survivors, finding properties for them. It's something people feel quite passionate about. And I think people have an image in their head of the kind of property that's required to support survivors of domestic abuse. What kind of property what would you say about that, Guy? What kind of properties are required?
I mean, I think in reality, pretty much anything. I mean, such a variety is what's needed, and I think traditionally there's an image of a domestic abuse refuge, which might have been a large building with sort of multiple rooms that that women and maybe their children were kind of living in a communal sense in. Actually, that yes, they do still exist, and yes, there is still a place for them. But actually, it's so much more than that is required. Ultimately, survivors need good quality accommodation that meets their very diverse needs. So it ranges from 1-bed flats through to 3-4 bedroom homes. In reality, we have of our own, the refuge provision that we run. Again, it varies from a one which is a 4-bed home where individuals live communally together, to another scheme which is in effect a block of flats, really, with 15 flats of different sizes, and some communal space where people can come together. But the important thing is they're safe, and that they're in neighbourhoods and communities where people kind of want to live. Increasingly, there's a need for, and certainly commissioners are looking for, providers to be using what they describe as dispersed accommodation, which is literally homes within a community where the support can go into people living in their own home, in a sort of domestic house in residential areas. I think the important thing is to look at is the neighbourhood, is the community safe? Obviously, you don't want to be putting people who are at risk in sort of risky areas. Thinking about the space so that maybe they're accessible to schools, they're accessible to public transport, they're accessible to work, actually. But the reality is a combination is required. And certainly, we work with a number of, whilst we provide services support ourselves, we also work as a landlord providing accommodation to a number of locally based grassroots women's-led organisations who provide domestic abuse services, and they will want a variety of different units. I think the other thing, it's not just about that sort of crisis accommodation. It's also about move on, enabling people who may have moved very quickly to need somewhere safe to live, but also it's about where next, where can survivors move on to start to rebuild their lives, and maybe step in terms of, it could be their kind of a long-term new home, but it also could be about sort of step down from the intensity of a refuge style provision to starting to live a little bit more independently, but knowing that support services are around. So the short answer is any good quality accommodation, really. The reality is there will be a need for it, and it's hard to, in some areas it's really hard to come by. There is certainly, we know that the demand sadly far outstrips supply at the moment, and we've seen certainly through the pandemic significant increases in reports of domestic abuse, which sadly means to more people needing that accommodation. But the reality is pretty much anything that offers a good quality accommodation could well be suitable to a support provider.
So it's the kind of property that most landlords are going to have in their portfolio, really, isn't it? It's a whole range. And I think one of that, obviously that's what we're doing with Gateways, trying to increase the demand, the availability of property for a whole different loads of providers in all different sectors.
And I think the reality, the particular I guess the particular importance is that obviously it's to try to keep these addresses as confidential, and we certainly don't want to be shouting about it. Certainly traditionally, support services, they would want to be as discreet, would want to be discreet, and it may well be appropriate to put some sort of target hardening measures into some of the property to make sure that they do remain safe. But the reality is, for the vast majority, they just need to be in kind of safe communities, and the kind of the sort, as you say, the sort of accommodation that most landlords are likely to have within their portfolio. But again, it's a conversation with those providers about whether or what you have available might suit that particular need.
And there isn't just a one size fits all, is it? Because each survivor of domestic abuse is going to have different requirements, depending on children with them, not children with them, whatever their situation is. And I think that move away from that one size fits all kind of refuge model is very much to be welcomed, isn't it? It fits far better for people.
Yeah, refuge is great for some people, but it's not. But I mean, but equally, it's not the right place for everybody. But actually, you can offer that quality of refuge support in a more dispersed model. The reality is probably what most providers are looking for is a sort of a mix of both.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you think property investors need to think about or be aware of with domestic abuse?
No, I mean, I think probably the key is about developing that relationship with the specialist support providers. Just talk to them, engage with them to understand what their particular needs might well be, and how you can develop that longer term relationship, really, because ultimately, as I said, the need for the accommodation is there. I mean, it may well be that it becomes appropriate to sort of recycle. So actually, what a particular property might be right for a period of time, you might want to move it on at some point if perhaps it becomes known. And what you don't want is it to become known as sort of domestic abuse accommodation, particularly. I'm sort of thinking about the kind of neighbourhood, but I think really it's about develop those relationships, kind of understand what the local need is and what the local need might well be into the future, and work with those partners on how you can add some value to their relationship.
That's great. Thank you, Guy. It's been lovely chatting to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.